And here we are. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And it's a Monday morning, the 28th of October of 2024. And wow, just 8 days until the big election. And I know most people are thinking about that. I today have been digging into an article about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which gives me the other side of Franklin Roosevelt in no uncertain terms from the Mises Institute. Now, you all know that I've studied the history of this period in different ways, read a lot of books, and made a few comments about it. But I never thought of FDR as a real villainous or enemy character, the way that people associated with the Austrian School of Economics and the gold standard uh, do. Of course, one of the famous things that he did was to take the U.S. Gold away from the people that owned it. You know, my grandparents lost some and had to turn in real gold for pieces of paper from the federal government. And the exchange rate was set in such a way that the government made a profit. So that's one thing about FDR that I've never really been happy with is why did he take away our gold? And that's, I guess, a good way to start into this rather long essay. I don't know how far I'll get, but I will always reserve the right to jump in and make my own comments, as that's really what we're about here at McDuff Lives Mindfields shows, is to uh, help me to just flesh out my own understanding. And hopefully that may have some beneficial effect for others as well. And it's just a joy to share these things with you, by the way. So that's another reason, because it gives me pleasure, and I love your comments. So I may not look at the comments today, but keep them coming. I always benefit and look at them after the show. We are broadcasting on YouTube today because I don't think that YouTube is going to find anything that they can call medical misinformation in this show. And I wanted to draw all my YouTube folks back into the the McDuff universe here, which centers around the Rumble channel right now, where I've never been censored and have always found myself feeling comfortable. And that's the only way I'm going to do this. And let's see, I think I will share the screen for you just because it's a let's see, do I already have that? Sorry, I don't mean to hold up the proceedings. Ah, here comes my tea. Thank you, honey. The great drummer coming in with my cup of tea. All right, I just want another second to arrange this so it's easier for everybody to see it. And the source again is the Mises Institute. The Mises Institute is a libertarian think tank and lobbying outfit. You often see them at the events for LaRouche and Schiller people, Scott Ritter, other folks that are trying to build a consensus of disparate thinking people that want to challenge the powers that be. And maybe that's a simple, succinct way to put it. Anyway, good people. I disagree with a lot of what they say, but I think it's really important that we not just accept the FDR is a good guy stuff that we read in our history books. without a critical examination, and that's what this article provides. Wait a minute. All right, I think this is the best we're going to do. And I guess you can blow it up later and read it yourself, or just go to the website. It's at Mises.org, and you'll find the article by title. So here we go. We'll probably not make it all the way through, but I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. So let's go. Part one, early years. As we approach the end of, oh, this is written actually in 2000, in 1999, just before 2000, and the date on it, 7/01/2024, is false because Ralph Ryko passed away many years ago. So this is an anachronistic citation that really doesn't doesn't do anybody any good. Well, I think it's more important to think of this man writing in the context of right before 9/11. As we approach the end of the 20th century, the figure of Franklin Roosevelt looms ever more imposing in the minds of Americans. In the 2 centuries or so of our history, it has happened that a few of our leaders, a very few, became symbols of some powerful idea, one that left a permanent imprint on the life of our country. Thomas Jefferson is one such symbol. With Jefferson, it is the idea of a free, self governing people dedicated to the enjoyment of their God given natural rights in their work, their communities, and the bosom of their families. Abraham Lincoln symbolizes a rather different idea of America as a great centralized nation state, supposedly dedicated to individual freedom, but founded on the unquestioned authority and power of the national government in Washington. And now Franklin Roosevelt, too, has come to represent a certain conception of America, one that is worlds apart from Jefferson's vision and different from anything that even Lincoln could have imagined. Roosevelt stands for the national government as we know it today, a vast, unfathomable bureaucratic apparatus that recognizes no limits whatsoever to its power, either at home or abroad. Internationally, it gives every evidence of intending to run the whole world, of extending its hegemony, now that the Soviet Union is no more, to every corner of the globe. Domestically, it undertakes through an annual budget of close to $2 trillion to assuage every real or invented social ill, and thus enters into every aspect of the people's lives. This is 24 years ago, right? It happens 10 times that now, right? In particular, it is engaged in what even a couple of decades ago would have seemed fantastic, a campaign to annihilate freedom of association, subject to subjecting the American people to a program of radical social engineering in order to transform their voluntarily held traditional beliefs and values and way of life. More than anyone else, Franklin Roosevelt is responsible for creating the Leviathan state that confronts us today. Well, they must be talking here in the essay, and I'm sorry to be confusing this, but it appears that somebody has edited this essay to reflect what happened during the pandemic, and that's why it's dated this past July. In his own time, FDR had many influential enemies in business, politics, and the press, men and women who recognized what he was doing to the republic they loved and who fought him tenaciously. They were proud to be known as Roosevelt haters. Today, however, practically the whole of the political class of the United States has been converted into idolaters of Franklin Roosevelt. This state of affairs was epitomized last May when the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. Now we're back to 2000, okay? Situated on a 7.5-acre site by the tidal basin, it included an 800-foot wall, I guess 6 waterfalls, outdoor galleries, and 9 sculptures. Congress voted $42.5 million to fund the memorial. Republicans, those wild revolutionaries, joining Democrats with equal enthusiasm. No one breathed a word about Roosevelt's failure to end the Depression, his lying us into war, his warm friendship with Joseph Stalin, and similar milestones in his long career. The major controversy was over whether or not he should be shown with his signature jaunty cigarette holder. Parentheses, in deference to the forces of political correctness, he wasn't, close parentheses. Boy, that political correctness is really changing everything. I saw a movie on the plane uh, when we were flying home, and it was produced by Kevin Costner, and it was called Horizon or Horizons, and it's all about the Wild West, the frontier, and the the army officers that are out there talking about what everybody knows they called the Indians are using phrase the indigenous people. Can you imagine John Wayne saying the indigenous people or anybody else that was alive in the 1900s that knew that the way that you referred to those indigenous people back then was Indians, and now we're going to make all the cowboys politically correct. I'm sorry. Most revealing was that self-styled conservative organs such as National Review and the American Spectator joined in the hosannas. It is a sign of how far things have moved that abject adulation of Franklin Roosevelt is now the order of the day, even at the Wall Street Journal. The Journal had long been supposed to be the voice of American business, a quality paper that stood for the market economy and limited government, and so was the counterpart to the New York Times in the American press. On the occasion of the dedication of the FDR Memorial, the Journal expressed its opinion through an article by one of its editors, a certain Dorothy Rabinowitz, who used to review movies. Rabinowitz was outraged that Edward Crane, president of the Cato Institute, had dared to refer to her hero as a lousy president. No, she insisted Roosevelt was a great one. Why? Well, because of, quote, the depth of his hold on minds and hearts, unquote. Oh, doesn't that sound like Kamala? The depth of his hold on minds and hearts. Because in the midst of the Depression, he gave the people hope, because he stood firm against Hitler, because when he died, even Radio Tokyo called him a great man. Roosevelt's many enemies in his time and even now never had any good reason to condemn this man who changed America so radically. They were merely maddened by hatred of him. In all of Rabinowitz's effusion, there were no hard facts, no analysis, no argument, and certainly no mention of FDR's great friend Joseph Stalin. A lot more about this later. It was all sentimental gush, and the Wall Street Journal enters the age of Oprah Winfrey journalism. Such productions by FDR's devotees are by no means mere exercises in historical myth making. They perform a vital political function for the anti freedom forces in contemporary America. Simply put, the glorification of Franklin Roosevelt means the validation of the Leviathan state. Okay. Yes, we're going back to the 17th century and Hobbes, the Leviathan state. And you understand if you don't, the Leviathan is represented by a giant whale, and the giant whale is the biggest fish in the ocean, or and all the other little fish have to do what the Leviathan says. That is the Leviathan state uh, as proposed back in the 17th century. Thus, it is of great importance to those on the freedom side to understand who this man really was, what he really stood for, and what, as a matter of fact, of historical truth, he inflicted on the American Republic. Franklin Roosevelt was born in 1882 at the family mansion overlooking the Hudson River on the 1,300-acre estate that came to be known as Hyde Park. On his father's side, Franklin could trace his ancestry back to the middle of the 17th century when a forebear immigrated from Holland to what was then New Amsterdam. Part of the family settled in Oyster Bay, Long Island, eventually producing Franklin's distant cousin Theodore. The Hudson Valley Roosevelts tended to marry well, mainly into affluent families of English descent. By the time Franklin came on the scene, he was, despite his name, of nearly purely English heritage. His mother, Sarah, was from an equally prominent family, the Delanos. Now, Delano is an old English name, believe it or not, although it sounds rather French or Italian. Franklin was his doting parents' only child. While by no means fabulously rich, the family was of the sort that mingled freely with the Astors and the Vanderbilts and the rest of the high society of nearby New York City. Until the age of 14, Franklin was tutored at home. Not at all a bookish boy, he loved nature, and above all, boating on the Hudson and at the family summer home in Campobello, Maine. He developed a passion for stamp collecting, which he pursued all his life. By the way, I did that too when I was about 12 years old. Got a, I, I really got a bug and did stamp collecting for all the way until I got into college. His admirers later claimed this hobby gave him great insight into the geography, resources, and character of all the world's nations. More pro-Roosevelt blather. He often visited New York and toured Europe every year with his parents. The inevitable word to describe the Roosevelts and their lifestyle is patrician. Franklin's public school was Groton, near New London. It says Massachusetts. I think that obviously is Rhode Island. New London, Massachusetts. No, London is in Connecticut, isn't it? Never mind. As close to an English public school as one could get on this side of the Atlantic. The whole ethos of the place was Old English, an attempt to copy the educational experience of schools such as Eton and Harrow, whose job it was to shape the future ruling class of the great world empire. At Groton, Franklin lived and studied among the progeny of his own class, those who felt themselves to be the fated future leaders of American business, education, religion, and above all, politics. Ironically, a fellow Grotonian in Franklin's day was the young Robert McCormick, whose father owned the Chicago Tribune. Ironically, because Colonel McCormick, as he was known in later life, went on to become the greatest and best known Roosevelt hater of them all. Isn't that interesting? There's your Chicago versus New York already. Franklin was a mediocre student at Groton in every respect. In 1900, he went on to Harvard, showed little interest in studies, coasted with a traditional gentleman's C average that was perfectly acceptable to the sons of the elite at that time. Of course, I'm moving along a little because I see the clock moving, and this essay is too long for me to cover in one show. Particularly fascinating to Franklin must have been the way Teddy Roosevelt was able to turn his patrician background to his advantage. After all, in the past, the Americans had shown themselves wary of upper class leaders who were suspected of being insufficiently democratic and not in tune with the people. What TR did brilliantly was to introduce Caesarism into American politics. This term refers to the political strategy adopted by Julius Caesar to gain power. Although himself from a wealthy and high-born family, Caesar castigated his fellow patricians and appealed instead to the lower classes for support. They, in turn, loved the favors they received from on high, and perhaps even more, the sight of Caesar trouncing and humbling his fellow blue bloods. Julius Caesar was thus one of history's great demagogues, and ever since his time, the tactic of a politician from society's elite pandering to the have-nots against the upper classes has been known by his name. In fabricating his persona as the great trust buster, Theodore Roosevelt's form of American Caesarism proved wildly successful. Interesting, Manchester's famous biography of General MacArthur called him the American Caesar. While Franklin was learning from his cousin's political stratagems, he also entered into a closer personal relationship with the Oyster Bay branch of the family, looking around for a bride. He'd become acquainted with the daughter of one of TR's younger brothers, and after a whirlwind courtship, won her hand. Isn't that this is goes all the way back to the Egyptians, folks. The elites are going to marry within their kinship. Eleanor proved herself to be an astonishing phenomenon and deserves our close scrutiny in her own right. Well, we're going to skip that passage. It's very interesting, but we're going to skip it. 1914 to 1916, Niccolo Machiavelli, the famous Renaissance political philosopher, had a low opinion of his fellow man. In The Prince, he advised rulers to make free use of deception in their quest for power. Men are so simple that the deceiver will always find those ready to be deceived. Oh, I think P.T. Barnum said it. There's a fool born every minute, and you know, the idea of taking advantage of them as part of being a person. I mean, there's a lot of people that feel that way. I think we have encountered one of them in Peter Thiel, who clearly has no qualms about walking over people's backs to get his own uh, financial rewards. And who else? George Soros, and a whole host of these big money puppets on both sides. Come on. And I don't exclude Elon Musk from this. Just look at his background. So, the average run of humanity, fools that they are, judge by appearances rather than realities. For instance, quote, a certain contemporary ruler is forever preaching peace and good faith, unquote, and since people go by words instead of deeds, he is believed. His deeds, however, show him to be an enemy of both who has never honored either one. Woodrow Wilson spoke incessantly of his passion for peace and his hatred of war, and he has usually been taken at his word by historians and the public alike. Yet the realities of his presidency were quite different. Even prior to embroiling the United States in the carnage of World War I, Wilson repeatedly intervened with military force in Latin America. Arthur S. Link, the most celebrated of Wilson's scholars and the most pious of worshipers, conceded that the years of his administration witnessed intervention, quote, on a scale that had never before been contemplated, even by such alleged imperialists as Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, unquote. Since the Navy and Marines were Wilson's chief instruments, Franklin Roosevelt, his energetic and ambitious Assistant Secretary of the Navy, barely 31 at the time, was a key collaborator. In these forays south of the border, Roosevelt advocated and supervised what liberals traditionally denigrated as gunboat diplomacy. I didn't know that. I didn't know Franklin Roosevelt was involved in the affairs in Mexico and Latin America, but that's a side that we need to take into account. The United States sent troops into Cuba, extending a protectorate over Nicaragua, and imposed a military occupation on the Dominican Republic. In 1915, Haiti was invaded and subjugated at the cost of about 2,000 Haitian lives. Of course, that provided some test subjects for Cornelius P. Rhodes at the Rockefeller Institute, did it not? Marine General Smedley Butler was commander of the operation in Haiti, which he ruled as a police state. He boasted that roads were being built at the cost of only $250 a mile. Since General Butler had thousands of Haitians kidnapped, compelled them to live in camps under Marine Guard, and forced them to work on the roads, it is small wonder that he was able to show such excellent cost control. His boss, Franklin Roosevelt, visited Haiti on a tour of inspection. Roosevelt found Butler's regime eminently satisfactory. The Haitians had been raised to the level of civilization by true progressive principles and were now ready for democracy. The Caribbean and Central America were sideshows, however, to Wilson's meddling in Mexico, where he tried to manipulate the course of a civil war. This led to the fiascos at Tampico and Veracruz. All right, I'm going to skip through those disasters. And as the crisis heated up, Franklin Roosevelt, on a trip to the West, kept issuing statements that on the likely outcome of events. It would be war, and we're ready, he told reporters. With barely concealed hypocrisy, he stated, I do not want war, adding, but I do not see how we can avoid it. But Roosevelt was unaware that in the meantime, the senseless bloodshed in Veracruz had given Wilson cold feet. Moreover, in Mexico, both sides in the Civil War now denounced Yankee aggression. Wilson backed off and accepted mediation. The crisis was diffused. No thanks to the surprisingly trigger-happy Assistant Secretary of the Navy, who had never experienced combat and who was destined, of course, never to experience it. As a high official of the administration, Roosevelt was able to observe firsthand Wilson's method of governing. One aspect that must have struck him, as it did others, was the peculiar role that the president devolved upon his intimate friend, wealthy Texan and Democratic Party politico Colonel Edward Mandell House. Mostly forgotten now, Colonel House was a curious package. The prevailing climate of opinion in Wilson's Washington in those days is suggested by the extraordinary influence he wielded. Never elected to any office, never confirmed by Congress, Colonel House nonetheless exercised more power in America than anyone except the president himself. Wilson once went so far as to say, quote, Mr. House is my second personality. His thoughts and mine are one, unquote. In 1912, House published a strange novel, Philip Drew, Administrator, A Story of Tomorrow. And by the way, guys, I read the first half of that book on my show. It's a Mindfields of maybe, I don't know, a year and a half ago. And it's really is a great way to get into the mind of both of these personalities, because it shows you the impetus of progressivism in the 20th century. And just to make a little footnote here, remember that progressivism comes basically from Teddy Roosevelt himself, whose party was the Progressive Party, the original Progressive Party. And what he was doing was breaking away from the Republican Party in in order to draw people into his progressive vision, which included a lot of social uh, improvements, but also was based upon a very aggressive foreign policy with the Great White Fleet and taking over countries in order to bring them into democracy. The whole idea of making the world safe for democracy is a Democratic Party idea that comes out of the progressive idea that, we are. It's just like we are the great white hope of Rudyard Kipling. It's just like the British, in other words, but it is an American style of it. And it is that American empire that begins to be built uh, when the Republicans take over in the late 19th century and start taking places like Hawaii and the Philippines and so many other uh, colonial ventures. That shows you that these Americans that were the progressives were also imperialists. It was just their empire as opposed to the British Empire. And that, I think, is a way to encapsulate the politics of today. Because you have the Democratic Party, which is very Keynesian economics, throw all the money at the people that you need to. The idea is to keep the people, the common people, uh, above, above water, not let them go under by social programs and welfare and spending, which is one side of the Masonic Hegelian dualism that we talk about. It's just like you have this extreme idea that the government is the answer to everything, and that is progressivism. Whereas the Mises Institute is the opposite. It's the Austrian school, represented by Friedrich Hayek. And they say that the government should stay out of the economy entirely and let the chips fall where they may, a very Darwinian fate for most of mankind, because they are not going to get any help. As a matter of fact, it's just like the British, Palmerston and them saying, well, it's God's plan that the Irish should starve to death, and we're not going to interfere. So, yeah, uh, what we're stuck now, we lost the real idea of America as far as in our government in the 19th century when Teddy Roosevelt comes along and creates progressive politics, which basically is elites saying we're going to help the lower classes enough that they're going to support us politically. And that way we will be able to run the government and build our empire, as opposed to the newer, really cold Republican, which is represented, by the coup of the DuPonts and the Rascub and all of that, the Smedley Butler put down. So there's really no good guys left in our political scene between the one side of the extreme economics of government runs everything versus the other side of government stays out of it. There is no common balance. But I think that in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's favor, I can say that he saw all of this. I mean, he was Masonic. He knew them. He knew the Freemasonry ideas, and he could see that both of these extremes have to be balanced somehow, or else we'll lose the country. And I like to believe that Franklin Roosevelt was using enough of this to keep the country afloat, while enough of the other to keep us from going communist. Well, let's read some more. And as you know, Philip Drew, he feels really sorry for all the poor people, and so he appoints himself a dictator in order to establish a permanent order of peace and justice. Isn't that nice? In the years immediately prior to the U.S. entry into the European War, a preparedness movement gained ground, spreading the idea that America needed a vast new armaments program to guard against the potential Hunnish invaders of our shores. I never heard of that. We're building up defenses against the Germans coming over here? Come on. Through preparedness, though preparedness was originally spearheaded by Theodore Roosevelt, his bitter enemy, Wilson climbed on the bandwagon. Franklin Roosevelt was probably the most bellicose member of the administration, and certainly the one with the most grandiose plans for the armed forces. The Navy Appropriations Bill presented to Congress, which was approved, appropriated $600 million to build 250 ships, the largest allocation ever voted for for the Navy by any nation. Once war came, the sky was the limit for Roosevelt's empire. By the end of the war, the Navy had expanded from 65,000 men to nearly 500,000 and more than 2,000 ships. As part of the preparedness campaign, Roosevelt advocated universal military training for all American youth. Others did as well, but he went much further. He asserted that all citizens owe a personal obligation to the government to assist in time of war. Roosevelt pushed a plan for total mobilization. It will include both men and women, some for the trenches, some for the machine shops, some for the offices, some for the railroads, and some for the sewing machines. Yet, national mobilization will not make us militaristic, he insisted. One of Roosevelt's major biographers, Frank Friedel, characterized this plan bluntly as a labor draft. Those are small words regarding the frivolous ideas of the young Roosevelt, but the reader is invited to ponder what they would have meant for our country. Aside from military preparations, Wilson's peacetime years saw innovations that augured ill for traditional American freedoms. In the year 1913, two fateful novelties were introduced. In February, the 16th Amendment legalizing the federal income tax was declared in effect. In December, Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act. Government power was reaching qualitatively higher levels, but this was nothing compared with what would occur once war came. And skipping ahead to the war, when the United States entered the First World War in April 1917, President Wilson announced his policy. It would be force, force to the utmost, force without stint or limit. That it would be force directed against the American people themselves soon became evident. On the economic front, as Murray Rothbard wrote, World War I was the critical watershed for the American business system. A war collectivism was instituted, which, quote, served as the model, the precedent, and the inspiration for state corporate capitalism for the remainder of the century. The Lever Act alone put Washington in charge of the production and distribution of all food and fuel in the country. Did you know that? 1917, uh, the government takes over food and fuel? Yeah. One of the chief progressives, Herbert Hoover, was appointed food administrator of the United States. And you got to read about Herbert Hoover and his extension of World War I and the starvation of the German people and the food. I mean, it was just a huge boondoggle that Hoover profited from, and the people of Belgium and Germany all suffered. A crazy, crazy idea to think that Herbert Hoover was a good guy. He was not. Hoover, afterward a revered conservative older statesman, had the government purchase the entire U.S. and Cuban sugar crops. Wow, what a nice deal for the sugar producers who were running their plantations with slave labor. Yeah, that's okay with us. We're progressives, right? Another progressive, Bernard Baruch, head of the War Industries Board, fixed prices and allocated priorities throughout much of the economy. Robert Higgs, in Crisis and Leviathan, lists some of the major statist intrusions in the course of the war. Quote, by the time of the armistice, the government had taken over the ocean shipping, railroad, telephone, and telegraph industries, commandeered hundreds of manufacturing plants, entered into massive enterprises on its own account in such varied departments as shipbuilding. And we've talked a lot about the shipbuilding and the ships over here in Mallows Bay on the Potomac River that were sunk there because they were useless, but they were the wooden ships that the government financed the production of for the wooden shipbuilders that were losing their market due to metal ships. Undertake, Undertaken to lend huge sums to business directly or indirectly and to regulate the private issuance of securities. Established official priorities for the use of transportation facilities, food, fuel, and many raw materials, fixed the prices of dozens of important commodities, intervened in hundreds of labor disputes, and conscripted millions of men for service in the armed forces. Unquote. Shrewdly, the Washington planners assured themselves of the collaboration of big business and organized labor by guaranteeing high profit margins and by pushing wherever possible for unionization of the sectors of the economy they now controlled. That's a big thing, okay? You have this traditional Democrats are good for the labor unions and the Republicans are bad for the labor unions, right? I mean, that's a big factor right now. Labor unions generally with some exceptions, are very, very pro uh, democratic and will enforce their uh, membership to uh, choose wisely, vote for the Democrats. That is still the 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 fake game. You know, Democrats are pro labor. No, they're not. They're pro labor unions. Labor unions control labor. That provides a service to the elites that are these progressive elites that are going to run things as long as they can get the votes. So this is one of the interesting and obvious factors that Democratic voters just don't see. They think that, oh, the only way to advance the workers' welfare and benefits and salary is to vote Democrat. Well, if you do, then realize that what you're doing is you're putting a limit on what you get, and it isn't going to get any better. If you see the history of what happens to the pension funds, oh, it was the Teamsters. Oh, it was the mafia. No, it's all planned. It's all theft. It's all grand theft. So, guaranteeing high profit margins to the DuPonts and the McCormicks and the, the Durants and whoever else you want to name as and the Rockefellers, of course, while just like old John D himself, handing out shiny silver dimes to people on video, on film camera, so that everybody could see that he was really a nice guy. So that's what we have. We have a lot of nice guy elites that want to keep in power on the basis of using Keynesian economics, printing money where necessary in order to keep their electorate voting for them, and enough propaganda to make sure that the other side is deeply resented and hated. Franklin Roosevelt, the dynamic young Assistant Secretary of the Navy who already cherished presidential ambitions, was an avid spectator of this statist. And statist is a word that they mean the state controls the economy, okay? Tidal wave. Hoover and Baruch were among his close friends. The latter was to remain so to the end of FDR's life. Much in Roosevelt's early New Deal, especially the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, was copied from what he himself called the Great Cooperation of 1917 and 1918. Besides wholesale violations of economic freedom, the war years saw the brutal suppression of freedom of speech and of the press, especially by means of the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Anyone who voiced dissent from the government's line was branded a traitor and treated accordingly. This, too, was noted by the young Navy bureaucrat, as was the supine acquiescence of the U.S. Supreme Court in these blatant infringements of the constitutional rights of Americans. Wow, does that sound like exactly what's been going on in the past 5 years here in the 2023 24 time? Yeah, the blatant violation of freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of conscience, all of the violations that have been racked up in the context of the so-called pandemic have advanced this stateism, the statist control, and the idea that we somehow, by voting Democratic, are going to escape from this empire is unfortunately as sad as the idea that by voting Republican, we're going to escape from this empire. What you have here are two gangs of oligarchs. And we can mention the technocrats at the top, such as Bill Gates and George Soros on the one side, and Peter Thiel and Elon Musk on the other side. And they're basically both of them are like, yeah, we're going to give you the total surveillance state. It's just a question of whose scheme to do it is going to prevail. There is not option three. The mythical Bernie Sanders, William Jennings Bryan, the farmer is the man option, the let's all get back to being Americans again. That's not on the agenda as far as I can see in this election. But I will say we have to keep voting because if we don't vote, then they're just going to take over everything. And just go vote for Richard Stans. For the Republic for Richard Stans. That's the best republic I can think of. And there's liberty and justice for all. So what's not to like? All right, they're going into the Lucy Mercer affair, and well, a lot of this is about Wilson and the League of Nations, and there was a very important incident in which FDR was caught up in what appeared to be the solicitation of men into the Navy on the basis of some underage young men that were set out as lures. That story is very interesting. Franklin himself vehemently denied any knowledge of the immoral methods used by the secret team he had set up. In essence, his attitude was don't ask, don't tell. So he was exonerated and his career was saved. Well, then we go into his unfortunate acquisition of the debilitating disease that they called polio at the time, and his uh, his strength, his inner strength that allowed him to somehow find a way that he could walk with the braces and to maintain his political uh, aspirations and positions, and not be put out to pasture. As I think you can understand how bad that would be if just because you're handicapped, you now couldn't follow your dreams. I admire him very much for the courageous uh, confrontation against his paralysis, and I think that is another thing that we need to take into account as we can see the dark side of the progressives and how Franklin Roosevelt was definitely one of them, and yet admire the man for his personal characteristics. Well, maybe this is a place to stop because I want to cover what is really the more important part of the essay, and that is from the time that he was the governor of New York, 1928, until his election to the presidency and all of the amazing events of 1933. So I will get back to this essay in a subsequent Mindfields, and I think I'll let this one go right here. But the idea is I really want folks to consider that it's not the good guys, the liberals versus the bad guys, the conservatives. It's two different imperial pursuits. One of them based upon the cold um, logic of Adam Smith and the BEIC and the British system of colonization and extraction of resources and the killing off of the native people as slave laborers or addicts to opium. That one versus the other imperial dream, which is to control the government by making the government the source of food, the source of medical, the source of everything you need for life, fuel, uh, everything you're going to need under a progressive government is going to come from the government. And that means you're basically a serf. So it's, serfs on one side and slaves on the other. It's not good for the common people. And we have to have some movement to bring us back to the original American dream, which I think is very, very well represented in books like H. Graham Lowry's "The How the Nation Was Won" and our good friend Anton Chaikin's book "Who We Are." The second volume of which we are anticipating will be released in December. And if you haven't read it yet, you need to get a copy of Who We Are and get up to speed because there are great historians, and Anton Chaikin is certainly one of them. So we can unfold this stuff. I really thought that this essay helped me to see that all is not good on either side of our political spectrum, and it is all part of that Joachim versus Boaz, the two pillars, and keeping us in between the pillars, fighting with each other while they step us above and control the whole game. Thanks for being with me. I will be happy to bring back Harley Schlanger tomorrow, the 29th of October, to the show right here at 11 a.m. Eastern Time.